All right, so we're all set. So we are recording now, starting at 2:07. And then, all right. Yeah, what Terry was referring to, and I don't know if Harry or Shane or Jenny's had a chance to see, but it's the chapter 2 outline. Oh, Jenny, you have it. I'm sorry, she mentioned it. That was posted to the website, to the state's website. So you can find it there, or if somebody has a link to it, Terry or somebody else, then maybe throw it in the chat there for Harry. But yeah, so like I said, I just kind of wanted to get a meeting started here. We met briefly last month at the state office. I don't think we really made much headway at that time, so I wanted to take a block of time to really kind of get a chance to really talk about these different points and maybe outline some ideas that we can bring back as to how to approach this. I'm open to suggestions on how to basically approach this, but my suggestion would be to just kind of start this off and look at the statutes sections that are outlined and under the statutory parts, and then kind of just have some discussion around those and what we think will be best ideas and approaches to kind of brainstorm around those different topics. And then from there, I think we can start to build it out, put some actual meat on the bones, as they say. But open to other suggestions on how to approach this as well.
Christine,
Yeah,
just
thanks,
one
Christine.
question. Yep. This is a question for you, actually.
Just going to quickly say something, Jenny. I think we would want to frame our focus around the permitting obligations. It's a little tricky, we know, with thinking about how the utility would be formed and what scale would it be at, and we can certainly get into that, but trying to bring it back to the focus of our chapter, which is, what would the implications be for the permitting? So that's one thing to keep in mind. And we had that printout with basically the breakdown of task, outputs, content, where's the expertise. And then I just also wanted to note, if any of you have useful resources, that we're certainly looking for those that might be able to be posted on the committee website related to utilities and permitting, and that could certainly be from other states, not just Vermont. And then we do have the SEMSWA meeting, and thank you, Christine, for letting us know about that. I think it's out of Colorado, I believe, and that presentation. So if we, during the course of this meeting, generate any topics that might be appropriate to bring up to them, hey, how have you guys dealt with this with your utility? That's something to consider. Just wanted to quickly throw those things out, but go ahead, Jenny, if you had something you were going to say there.
No, I just had a really basic question, which is I can't find the outline or any other materials other than the meeting link on the website. I do have the outline because it was attached to the meeting invite that I got, but can you tell me where we find these materials? Because I know at the last meeting there were materials, but I don't think they're there anymore. That we were using during the larger group meeting when we broke down for the first time into the different work groups.
Do you mean where on the website that would be located?
Yeah. Because I can see where the study committee work groups, it has the meeting times and it has the links to join the meetings, but I don't see the materials.
Yeah. I did not post that myself, so I would need to see where exactly that would have been.
I'm just wondering if anybody else who's on the call found them there, or if you guys, like me, found them attached to the invite.
I think it was on the materials is where I found some of the information. I couldn't find the spreadsheet that was flashed up at the last meeting. I had to go back to the video of the meeting to look at that spreadsheet because it was so small during the meeting I couldn't see it, but I couldn't find that anywhere on the web.
Yeah, I couldn't find it either because I know I took notes. That's why I'm trying to look back at my notes. But I don't think I copied it into my notes.
Well, in any case, I can send that to you, Jenny. Just give me 1 second here.
I mean, I do have it. I just think if
Oh, okay, you do. Okay,
it,
yeah,
so I'm fine. I have it. I've read it. I think it's good. I'm prepared to talk about it. Just, but for anybody else who might be
yeah,
watching this meeting after the
yeah.
fact and wanting to see it, they might not be able to find it.
Yeah, and I will definitely look into that ASAP. Yeah, I don't do the website posting, but we can easily get that done. But for now, does everybody have available that document in some form or another?
I don't, Terry. If you could possibly post it in the chat or send it along, I would appreciate it.
Sure, Harry, will do.
So, Carrie, what I believe, kind of going back to what you were what you were saying there, excuse me. And maybe I think what you're referring to is your number one under outline pieces, reviewing the existing rule permits and statutes and what's needed for a separate entity to assume permitting obligations on behalf of a 3-acre site. And then you kind of provide a sub-bullet, A, discussion mechanics for how a separate entity applies and assumes permitting responsibilities and applies with current permit conditions, such as annual permit fees, renewal fees, and engineering costs. The actual statutory language for that section is the proposed approach the state could use for implementing a regional stormwater utility that would allow utilities to assume the liability and responsibility for compliance with the water quality laws, including how a utility could assume responsibility for. So I think those are pretty closely aligned. I think that my little bit of a concern here, though, is just with the outline piece is the specifics of the 3-acre site in that language. And I think the committee has been pretty clear that we think this should, whatever comes out of this very likely should be broader or have the ability to take on permits that are not just limited to 3-acre. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jenny, or anybody else who was there for that last meeting, but
I think I would say, Christine, we could expand. Certainly, there wasn't an intent to limit it to 3-acre, but one of
Yeah.
the tasks was to cover 3 acres. So I just wanted to make sure
Oh,
we had the
Yeah.
3-acre in there, and then
Sure.
I would agree that we're not limited in scope to just that, and thinking more even longer term about once, if these utilities were formed, how could they be a benefit beyond just that?
Yep, okay. The reason why I'm bringing that up, Terry, is because and I think I've expressed this before, but there's been concerns from members, and from others I've spoken with that we want to make sure that this is not that we have the opportunity to kind of direct this and that it's not being overly directed by the agency. So just want to make sure that we have that opportunity.
Well, I think if we go to regionalization, we would like to be able to permit what is the biggest bang for your buck. And it might not be a 3-acre site.
Yep.
And I think that's the concern. We want to be sure that, this would not be limited. It would be through each watershed or whatever region we end up doing it, would be able to really do the best project for that area.
So I guess starting off with the first question here, which
Sorry.
is really.
I was muted. I was just going to say, I do read this language in the outline to not be limited to 3-acre sites in terms of what we're considering. But again, we might need to make recommendations for statutory changes in order to allow kind of offsetting changes that are outside of the 3-acre sites to be counted against the obligation for the 3-acre sites.
Yeah. So it sounds like we're on the same page. So I guess tackling this first question, reviewing the existing rules, permits, statutes, what's needed for a separate entity to assume permitting obligations. And I think that, I'm not specialist in statutory rules, but it seems to me that this would ultimately require some kind of delegated authority, or a new permit structure of some sorts. We have our 9050 operational permits, we have our MS4 permits, and we have our transportation permits. But I do believe the state has the authority currently to delegate authority to a local community for, for administering the permits, the 9050s. But I guess, Terry, you want to correct me on that? I don't know that it's necessarily spelled out in current statute or in the current 9050 permit, but I thought the state does have the authority to delegate its authority to a local municipality. Would that be correct or no?
But it's, yeah, the way it's worded is it would have to be covered under another general permit. So
Okay.
in the existing language, as I think you know, with the MS4, that's the framework, and that's what we know the most about in the current condition. So in terms of that delegation, right now, it still says, you need to have some state stormwater discharge permit under the Chapter 22 rule. Now, that could be a new type of permit, right? If there isn't something there now that adequately addresses what we're thinking of here, then that would be something to be considered for the rule and a new type of permit potentially.
So, yeah, okay, so I mean, that sounds like the short answer of that is that we'd have to, basically identify some type of structure or some kind of overarching umbrella permit that would allow this to happen, and likely outside of limited jurisdictions of like a municipal jurisdiction. Because I think a lot of the discussions that we've had to date is that this really should be, we should be able to look at, or this entity, this regionalized utility should be able to look at different locations within the watershed to best locate, some type of treatment practice.
So would this be like a two-phase thing where if we did go to regionalization, they would first take over existing permits, but maybe within 5 years would phase out to them getting the permits? You know what I mean? Like it would be, the region would get the permits. But at the beginning, they'd have to take over existing permits, right? Because that's what we'd have to do. And then eventually it would be the regionalization director or whatever who would be saying, okay, here's what we need to do next, prioritize the highest phosphorus removal, at least in the Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog areas. And I'm just throwing that out because it almost seems like a two-phase thing. Looks like Shane wants to.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, Luce. And I just wanted to bring up the question of, I think there's already the framework there for an entity with another permit to take over, whether it's 3-acre permits or any other stormwater permit. But kind of in the terms of the scope of this entity, and if there's other sectors where that entity is going to be able to achieve phosphorus reductions, I think that is more where there would be necessary changes. And Terry, you can feel free to chime in, but I don't think there's any framework there for, if this entity is doing both non-regulatory phosphorus, developed lands phosphorus removals, and agriculture phosphorus removals. That's where there's not the framework. And so just to bring that up as a question, more or less, because I know it was discussed in previous meetings on that scope of the
That's
entity.
a good point, Shane, and that's true under the current Chapter 22 stormwater rule and statute. We don't have that, cross-sector trading approach set up. That doesn't mean that couldn't happen potentially, but we need to consider revisions that would be added to the rule, to the general permit potentially, to enable an approach where, for example, you'd have some trading between, say, agriculture and the different sectors of the TMDL and getting into that. That would be, I think, a more just comprehensive set of changes, presenting more challenges. Again, not that it couldn't happen compared to just looking at staying within the developed land sector at least. But that's,
It seems like that could be a goal, but it might be a next phase goal. I'm just
Yeah.
trying to think of the easy way to make a change here, and too much would be a challenge. That's all I'm saying.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
But
I
it's a
totally
great-
agree.
I think it's the right final answer, but it's just, implementing it in pieces might be how the best way to do it.
Yeah, from my experience, yeah, even the push to get just the developed lands phosphorus reduction capabilities into, let's say, the clean water service provider network is going to be plenty of a push with the deadlines we have. I would love to see it bigger, but that's like probably a decade worth of work just to get that up and running. So
Terry, can you bring that back up again? Because I think some of the language in those statutes it's and it's an or. Stormwater utility seems to be pretty broadly used here, right? So you can see under 1.6 municipalities and stormwater utilities. So it's already being separated out.
Yep.
And so
it's there.
Yep. And so I guess
And my only
Yeah,
point was just to say that it just says, it has to be, if that happens, the takeover, like, let's say it's not an MS4, but it's a utility, there would still need to be the coverage under, an authorization or an individual permit under the rule, the stormwater permitting rule. So that's what the current language says in 9050. And so in the MS4 scenario, that would be the MS4 general permit. And if the utility was not going that route, then, and the utility was not permitting under general permit 39050, which is another option here. There's nothing that's saying there needs to be a new general permit necessarily. I think it just depends on where we want to go with this. General permit 39050 could be revised itself. It could be reopened. We could add language potentially to make some changes.
Yeah, so I'm just looking at the current language of the rule, and that's what I'm screen sharing. And basically, that's what you said, Terry. So if you have a municipality or a stormwater utility that has assumed full legal responsibility, then the other permit that municipality or stormwater utility has been issued will satisfy the 3 acre
that's
requirement.
what it's getting.
It's basically
here,
what it says right
other
now.
permit,
Yeah.
right? Which if
Right.
we're not saying MS4 here, that other permit, I don't think we have that now, right? So if that would be the same framework, we would need to
Like,
think
do you
about
have to
what
create
that is.
yeah, like what's the least change way of making this possible? And it probably would be to keep this rule, but to create some other permit that would be more
Yeah,
all encompassing.
I would say, like, revisions to either the rule or the general permit, or both if necessary. Often it ends up being both for consistency. That would be an easier and less time-consuming approach. And we already know we have to, for example, reissue our rule. We made changes to the general permit. Our rule just needs to be revised periodically anyway. It covers all of our permits, not just operational. So the MRGP, for example, is in there. It's pretty basic language, but if there are any changes that we need to bring into that, it was issued in 2019, so it's now been a good, 7 years. But yeah, just generally updating, reissuing, readopting existing rules and general permits is easier and a faster track.
And I think what you're saying, Terry, is you think it could be done without revising the statute, probably.
Yeah, that's a good question. We've had our attorney do some research already on that, and, she thinks there possibly could be some maybe minor additions or revisions to statute. There is already language related to utilities in statute, and it may just be capturing what we need for the purposes here that we're getting into. If we needed to allow for certain abilities of the utility to do certain things that maybe aren't there now. But I don't know that it would require a brand new, chapter of statute
Right.
potentially.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know
to
for sure.
me-
I'm not, but maybe not.
I mean, that's how I'm reading this. If you look at this language, that basically, what do you need to have? You need to have a municipality or a stormwater utility that has satisfied the requirements for taking full legal responsibility. And also they have to have either a general permit or an individual permit, but it doesn't specify what type of permit. So as long as you have a rule that would create or, broaden either a new permit type or broaden an existing permit type so that it meets that requirement, then I think that would be okay without a statutory change. But again, I'm just looking at it for the first time. And then the legal authority of the utility to accept responsibility. As you said, Terry, there's statutory language on that too, right?
Mhm. Yeah, I'd agree with that, Jenny. It's already there tied in when it says municipality or stormwater utility. I think a lot of that legal structure that's needed is already in existence. I don't know that this is.
Yeah, I'm just copying that. What does full legal responsibility mean? So just making sure that the entity has the right to maintain the system and a duty to repair and replace it
Mhm.
and to access it. Yeah, and I haven't searched yet, but here I can stop sharing for a second so I can search. But I know there's the statutory provision as well that I believe was actually in the statute that created this committee, right?
I'm sorry, one more
Well-
time, Jenny.
Well, 64.
Since- The bill that created this committee.
What's in the bill?
I thought there was some language about full legal responsibility and about that already created that, in addition to creating the study committee. But I'll look for it.
Any thoughts on incentivization for, if these utilities were to be formed, we would ideally want them to be, that's one of the ideas here, to be assuming some of these permitting obligations. But I don't think anybody's suggesting forcing anything, but thoughts on any elements here that should be included?
Terry, why would we not be considering you said force anything, but requiring these new regional stormwater utilities to right? I mean, I guess there's some different language. I see liability and responsibility. I see full legal responsibility. I think the word liability is got a lot of complications potentially. I'd love to suggest sticking with full legal responsibility, like is kind of embedded in the existing permits. But in my mind, if we're able to effectuate this, I'd like to see it so that either by rule or by statute, however it comes down, that the legislature establishes these regional stormwater utilities, who shall assume full legal responsibility for permit compliance.
Or, so
I
what
think if
would
this
that?
thing, if
It's
this
an
thing becomes,
interesting thought, Harry, but what would the scale are you thinking on that? That all permitting, 3 acre, what do you envision for that?
yeah, I think that for developed lands for sure. I think it gets more complicated if we start getting into agriculture. But really, I think one of the things in my mind, Terry, that makes our challenges with the 3 acre rules particularly challenging is the winners and the losers, and not everybody is in.
Yeah.
And I would love to see, some movement here in establishing these regional utilities. I prefer watershed based than trying to get into municipal lines. And, include in what these regional utilities are, required to do would be to assume responsibility for the existing permitting stormwater obligations.
For
And
3 acre only?
no, I keep hearing 3 acre. I want to say that there's more than just 3
I'm
acre.
just
out there.
asking. Just
Yeah, no,
asking.
I think this is, in order to solve the equity issue, this should be across the board.
Okay, so that would include a new development, right? A subdivision, somebody needs an operational permit. That would all be a part of this, where instead of the developer and an association of owners applying, the utility would take that permitting obligation on, even for new developments.
Well, I can think like we work for right now in our water and sewer, drinking water and sewer world. If a developer comes to town and wants to extend a water main, how we handle it is with a development agreement. And, we require the developer to, perform and have surety and has some backup as a utility so that if they don't perform, the utility isn't legally responsible. It's a pretty common mechanism in the utility world for dealing with additions and expansions and things to that effect when you're dealing with private development. And I think that same kind of concept can be applied to stormwater stuff.
I think Terry brings up a good point that I think it's a lot easier for new developments rather than existing, these older developments that didn't have the proper permit renewals and permits. It would seem new developments could be pretty straightforward, like Harry's saying, right? That seems to me a lot more straightforward. But the older ones, these older 3 acre sites or other sites, it would be nice if the regionalization would allow the region to again determine where the most value is for the dollar spent. And it might not be 3 acre sites.
Right, I hear what you're saying, but I think the concern becomes if you don't bring in even new developments, and there should be an opportunity to opt out, right? Because otherwise, you're forcing people, landowners to participate. So if for some reason, let's say, IBM or, somebody owns a bunch of land and they have their system, they're privately held and they don't want, this utility and maybe there's opportunity to opt out. But I'll tell you, it's going off what Harry just said. You think about Vermont Gas, you want them to come in, they're going to get an easement, they're going to have a right to come out there, inspect their infrastructure, make repairs, maintenance, upgrades. They have a right to the property, they have a right to access as part of that utility service. I think that if you don't allow new developments to participate in this, all you're doing is going to burden those residents down the road, because every 5 years there's a new permit. Those residents don't know anything about stormwater 9 times out of 10. And all it's doing is you're just burdening them further down the road. And they're going to be knocking on the doors saying, we don't want this, we don't want this. I mean, I get so many calls every year from, people that buy into HOAs that don't realize the obligations of those HOAs for these stormwater utility systems and the costs associated, the permitting complexities of it, the risks associated with it. There's a lot to it. And the more complex that they get, I think there's going to be more and more requests from residents, even in newer developments, to participate.
I'd like to maybe add on to that is I even wonder, I'm thinking about this a little bit as if I were charged with establishing a stormwater utility. And I would say that, in whatever region I was working on, we could probably incentivize the conveyance of easements and permitting obligations from these existing private entities to convey their stormwater systems and easements and permits to this new entity, and they become customers of the utility.
Mhm.
Yeah,
And
Okay.
honestly, when I think about the 3-acre sites that we're dealing with in Stowe, if there were a regional utility here, I think most of them would love to convey the permitting obligations and the systems that they are struggling with to a regional utility and become utility customers in order to get out from under these very technical challenges that honestly most Vermonters can't really fully understand. And it's a gray box that gives great concern to many of these property owners. And I think that I got a really complicated one that you're aware of, Terry, on Thomas Lane, Depot Street in Stowe, and we have 5 different entities that we're trying to negotiate a deal with, and all 5 of those entities would convey an easement tomorrow if they can get out from under this.
Mhm. Yep.
Yeah, if I can just jump in, I mean, I totally agree with that. I think with the new development side, it would just be, on the developer to install the infrastructure to whatever requirements per its operational permit to get a permit. And then the utility, like you're saying, Harry, those residents can opt in to become users of that utility. Then the utility can continue the ongoing work. I would just say, I think, in this question of how to incentivize the utility, like obviously it would be the purpose of this utility is to accept legal responsibility and maintain these systems. But I think there should be something where through like an evaluation criteria or just certain requirements that a site needs to meet for the utility to be able to accept that liability, such as easements. And if you had a site that maybe was being difficult and they didn't want to give easements and, you're looking at it and like you're saying, Luce, the utility is determining, oh, this site has a huge water quality impact. There's a like prime area that's undeveloped. at the bottom of the drainage area for this permit, but a certain property owner doesn't want to release easement to you to install that infrastructure. I think there should be, should be something where the entity doesn't just immediately assume responsibility. You have to check some boxes for the utility to roll that in, so that the utility isn't burdened with a bunch of sites that opt in, but then they refuse to let the utility do
Right.
retrofits on that site. And it's kind of jumping. I think I forget what number chapter is the funding for this utility, but I mean, the easiest way to incentivize, if it's a utility, is through funding. And so, depending on how that utility is being funded, whether it's a mix of, state grants and property owners that are rolled into the system paying a utility fee as well. Maybe it's like for every, similar to this next round of MS4 funding, is you get a certain amount of funding based on the acres of impervious you're going to roll from a 3-acre site that you're going to roll into your permit. If it reflects that, so a utility is wanting to roll in more sites to increase their state funding. I mean, that's kind of usually what everything comes down to, is funding. So that's an easy way to incentivize. And I think probably there's got to be a mix of both state level grant funding and utility user rates. And I think it makes it easier when navigating that. How do you charge the utility users? If it's not everybody in the watershed paying, then you're not going to worry about, okay, other people paying an MS4's stormwater utility fee and paying this regional entity and paying, whatever else. If it's only being charged to those sites that roll in, that makes it a little cleaner in that sense. But I'll digress there. But I think there should be something for the entity that those sites have to meet before the entity says, yes, we'll roll you in.
But I don't know that needs to be necessarily part of the statute, right? I think that a utility could establish that within their own,
Guidelines.
yeah, their own standards and procedures, right? Because there are communities right now that will take over systems that are in existence that don't require upgrades being made. Then there's other communities that do require them to be brought up to current standards for their take-in, and that seems to be working pretty well. So I think that's those are the kind of details that utilities can work out for themselves on how best to approach it. But
yeah, I just meant it as the way of, I think there should be some incentive for the utility to do that, but maybe whatever is baked into this statute, that it isn't, they're automatically compelled and they have to assume legal responsibility of every single expired stormwater permit or whatever in their watershed. They want to bake it in that they should, but giving them a little bit of flexibility there to require things.
I can see what you're saying, Shane, right? Because then somebody doesn't want to pay the money to upgrade their system, might try to sue the utility, saying that you're, failing to meet your obligations. I think so. Yeah. So I mean, I think maybe some of the language needs to be included is, that the utility cannot deny like a reasonable request of a compliant system or something like that. I mean, there could be a reasonability, kind of clause there.
It comes down to also what, like Shane said, the funding, right? And the charges to the utility, the people that are part of the utility, how you would charge them for becoming part of the regional utility. Whether it's, I know we had a study done, right, by Andrew Brown, is that right?
Mhm.
But he only looked at per capita cost. I mean, he didn't look at what if you did it by impervious area? That wasn't something he looked at, which would have been something I would want to look at, I think. Or yeah, somehow charging it based on that, because that's kind of how, we're looking at land area. That's what we're looking at, impervious land area.
And,
And then-
you know, oh, sorry.
Sorry, my concern is the permit's only good for 5 years, and if changes are made that, like we're going from retention or detention ponds to gravel wetlands, which can be quite expensive, right? We just spent on Boulder Hill close to 300,000, I think, to do that.
Close to 400,000.
Close to 4. So, was that the best value for the watershed? I'm not convinced of that one, because they already had a system in place. Whereas we have other straight pipes right to our repaired brooks in Shelburne. So, that's what I think our goal would be here, is to try, and then how to figure out how to charge people, maybe based on impervious area in their development. I don't know, because we know too, the maintenance can be expensive. Cleaning out existing ponds can be pretty pricey. So we've got to make sure the regional utilities have enough funding to be able to do the maintenance.
And if for those utility users, if it's like a flat rate based on your impervious coverage, that equalizes the equity of those sites. Not if like, okay, one site we're doing treatment at, and it's going to cost 400,000. One site we're only doing $100,000 treatment, but the $100,000 one has 3 times the impervious as the other one. To find like a flat rate based on impervious would be the most equitable.
Right, because you've seen, Shane, the projects coming back in, they vary all over the map. Some are really simple.
Yeah.
Right? You're like a $65,000, I say simple, $65,000 fix compared to a $400,000 fix.
Yeah. I mean, we have some that, through simple disconnection don't require anything but spending $40,000 for the engineers to tell the state that nothing needs to be done. And then we have some, that are maybe close to $1 million. Yeah.
Kate, do you think the water quality goals are being achieved?
Through
Models versus monitoring?
Model versus monitoring, thank you.
Yeah, that's been a big question on my mind.
And I see in this draft here, it's responsibility for compliance with the water quality laws. Terry, what if the best management practices aren't getting it done? Do we really have confidence that gravel wetlands are in fact achieving the goals?
Well, there's a ton of research on them. I think if you're talking about a site-specific situation where there isn't maintenance performed or it wasn't built correctly.
Ton of research in northern climates.
UNH Stormwater Center, they have test gravel wetlands. We're getting a little off subject here. Not that I don't want to talk about this stuff, but this isn't necessarily on task. I mean, we put the gravel wetlands in there because they did have their performance had been confirmed through research. It is a range. It's not that every site is going to get exactly, 77.25. It's an expected range of pollutant reduction.
Let me ask this, Terry. I get it. You don't want to diverge. Let me ask this. Does the TMDL require compliance with a model or compliance with phosphorus reductions?
It's both.
Right, but we don't require monitoring now after a system's put in place. We're relying on the model. Is that correct, Terry?
Well, the looking at the phosphorus reductions, it's done at the point much closer to the lake, rather than site by site, what's going on, because you have so much variability depending on season and whether, things have been exceptionally dry or wet. It's difficult to conduct a sampling program that would give you any really robust results if you were to go to every 3-acre site and try to do that. It'd be very expensive and time consuming.
Yeah, I know it's really expensive because we tried to do it at UVM on the Main Street pond upgrades, trying to get pre and post monitoring, and it was really expensive. we changed the medium in the gravel wetlands. I know this is a side to this, but we're convinced that new medium is working, right? Because the study's done.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Anyway, we're getting off track. Sorry. Let's get back on track.
So I've been trying to take notes and I can screen share again. I don't know if my notes are that good or if I captured all of the discussion that just happened, but would it be helpful if I screen shared and you guys can take a look and see if I captured the discussion? Or Terry, are you already also taking notes?
I am. I mean, if you'd like to, if the other members would benefit, or you want to share your screen briefly, I don't mind.
I'll try it. I don't think these are necessarily the greatest notes on this section, but I think it was a really interesting conversation about the additional incentives. I mean, what I wrote down was a lot of property owners would be glad to give easements in exchange, it's supposed to be exchange, for the utility taking on responsibility, but there's a concern about utilities or municipalities being required to take on systems they don't want to. So it needs to be equitable, and that there need to be a variety of funding sources, including the ability to assess within the utility. And then it would be equitable to base it on the amount of impervious surface. I put it in myself about whether you should also consider site conditions like slope. And then again, thing I wrote in myself, but ensuring that the utility is a type of entity that can fully accept all of the funds from all of the different sources, and also that has the legal ability to make assessments if that's going to be a part of the equation.
And is this going to be just for residential or residential and commercial? I know someone talked a little bit about IBM, but is this going to be residential and commercial that we're recommending this?
I would say yes,
Has to be.
because so many businesses are really, a lot of times you're talking property managers or investment companies that own them. They get sold, they have out-of-state operators,
Mixed-use
and-
buildings and developments.
Yeah, a lot of mixed use now.
Yep,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. Okay.
The other thing I'd like to add there, I ensure the ability, utility is type of entity that can accept funds and also make assessments. I want to suggest that regional stormwater utility almost needs to have municipal powers.
Yeah,
They
as
really,
they go.
they need to be able to condemn land. If it's really truthfully going to be based on achieving phosphorus reductions and meeting the water quality laws, it may be necessary for that regional utility to condemn that property on the low side of that, watershed to build a stormwater system to meet the goals.
So it'd be
And
like an
so-
eminent domain,
Yeah. Absolutely. They got to be able to set the rates. I think, on impervious area makes sense to me. I'm not sure exactly how to handle farming and silviculture, but these utilities need to be able to pay the bills too.
And that's a good point. Yeah, go ahead.
That would include the bills for the permitting, and potentially, if there is a new framework set up, there could be certain permitting fees that may be able to be waived. I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, with the MS4, are the permit renewals, at least for those permits, the fees are waived or no? Just the renewals, I mean, is that? But anyway, I'm just mentioning that, that would be a part of if there is a state permit, we have an administrative processing fee that applies for just about all of our permits. And then for operational, if it was an operational permit, there'd be that annual operating fee. So
I think I'd be concerned about getting too redundant here though as well, as far as like these utilities got to have some level of authority to make determinations that, the systems that are being brought under their jurisdiction are are up to standard and everything else. And I think maybe a lot of the permitting, I guess, actually on the operational level or even on the construction permit level might go through them and not so much through the state. Because otherwise, maybe it's overreaching, but not overreaching, maybe that's too broad of an idea, but I'm looking at, I'm looking at some of the numbers here it's been taken for some of these minutes to get, approved, and they can take quite a long time. It looks like only 67% of the operational stormwater permits actually met the timelines that are required under the PEP standards. So they're not getting permitted in a timely manner currently, and so and this kind of ties back to what will be the fees. So if a utility has to go through a bunch of, spend a lot of money on spend a lot of money on renewing their permits through the state, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. We should be able to find a way to reduce their burden to have to do that, to have to file, fees for their permits, or at least keep them minimal. There's no sense for them to collect money and then give it to the state.
I'd like to throw up another thought. So in our wastewater world, we have discharge permit and solid waste management permits that we have obligations to the state on. And in the drinking water world, we get a permit to operate, right?
Mhm.
We have direct responsibility as a utility to our state regulators.
Mhm.
Instead of getting like entangled with these regional utilities, taking on the various different stormwater permits that exist out there, maybe they get an operating permit and they have the responsibility of managing these systems within their region to achieve the goal, and the state's oversight of that is under an operating permit, not necessarily kind of getting hung up on is this 90/50 site, part of the regional or whatever.
Right, rather than 5,000 permits
One.
across the state, you have this utility region that has a permit. You could probably break it down to 5 to 7 right across the state, depending on the number of utilities that you have. I think that's what you're getting to, right, Harry?
It is.
Yeah,
It
and I
is.
think that has to happen. Otherwise it's just going to, yeah, I mean, it's just
Too much paperwork.
it's too much paperwork, and it drives the cost up for people. All it's doing is driving cost up.
Are
So
the
Barry, with the
regions,
operating permits, so rather than having a permit that's issued every 5 years, you have one permit that gets issued, and then presumably it's periodically reviewed, inspected, whatever, by the state, but there's not a permitting fee per se that comes up every 5 years. Is that how it works?
Well, we have to renew.
Yeah.
And
every 5 years?
yeah, and so I mean there is still a mechanism for state oversight and renewal and changes. Things happen with our discharge permit. The state may decide that we got to lower our effluent concentration for a particular constituent, and we're charged with figuring out how to deal with that. So in the utility world, that's a pretty common kind of model and structure.
How would the regions deal with a common plan of development? I know maybe we talk about that later down the road, but now it triggers if it's a new building site with shared infrastructure, right, Terry, then you get kicked into a common plan of development. If you didn't have an Act 250 for the whole project, I guess the regions would have to.
Well, and that's, I think that,
Maybe that's the
I think
developer.
that's the idea though, is that if you get this, if you provide a regional permit and you basically, you get away from that need to have all these common plans of developments and who has to be, who's on the permit and who needs to come into a stormwater agreement with another private.
With other
partner.
neighbors who,
And
yeah,
and that's what's driving these costs of these programs through the roof and burdening everybody. And that's why they're up there, you know, their hands are up in the air and they're yelling at their representatives.
right, because it feels anti-housing and that's not what we're trying to do these days, right? We're trying to promote housing and making it really challenging for some of these developments that want to add 1 or 2 houses.
So so I think kind of going back to what Harry was saying, it makes a lot of sense that in order for this to really be a streamlined, you know, that if for the outcome of a regionalized utility to be streamlined and reduce burden on residents, then I think it should be a umbrella utility that stormwater utility gets, and all these little 90/50s, 90/20s, 90/10s get dissolved. And they get absorbed into, once they get brought under the umbrella of that larger regional utility, then that permit gets dissolved more or less. And that happens with our MS4s right now.
And I guess to get, you know, back to if we're gonna grab someone's property for eminent domain, you know, we'd have to ask the state for funding for that, right? Because that can get expensive. I mean, I'm just
I
saying,
think
it can get
It
expensive,
can get expensive, I think.
both on legal fees and the cost of land.
Well, I think it's a power that I think what Harry was trying to get to with that is that it needs to be a power that they have, right? So a
Right.
quasi-governmental entity, like you have like solid waste districts.
But I'm just saying I would like to see, you know, where the state funding would come into play if we know that would really improve the phosphorus reduction. You know, in a region, then we would have to figure out how to make that happen.
Well, I think the best person to talk about state funding just showed up. But I think that you know, to kind of address that without and I let Deanna kind of get us situated here, but there's a lot of money already in the Clean Water Fund that goes out to all these different programs and projects and, you know, communities and things like that. So I think there's a lot of money already that's there, and I think that if we were able to get it into the hands of these utilities, that they may be more resourceful with it. Because a lot of money gets burnt up already right now, just in administrative cost. Because there's just so many people involved with every project.
I'm sorry
Yeah.
I'm late and just wanted to say hi, everyone, and thanks for letting me join today. Terry, let me know if there's anything I can help with, and just catching up to speed on your talking revenue. I'm happy to speak to that at some point, and curious the tie to the permitting component, if there's different structures you folks have been wrestling with.
We were talking about the section about incentives to compel or motivate a utility to assume permitting obligations. And so I think that's really the focus right now. It seems like a really good discussion, but part of the issue is the degree of funding that will be needed, the idea that there needs to be some equitable consideration for the utility not being required to take on systems that they don't want to or without the capacity to deal with them, but that they would need not only to accept funding such as grants or assessment, but really to deal with kind of the totality of taking on this obligation. And so that's why it just does seem that there need to be as broad, you need to have a type of entity that has the capacity to accept as broad funding sources as possible, and also with the idea that that funding would be available and that there would be some equity to how it became available, whether it was through assessment or through grants or other funding sources.
I mean, how
I
are
don't know.
clean
Did
water
I capture that, Christine?
Yeah, I think you did capture it pretty well. I mean, but how did the clean water service providers, how are they incentivized?
Yeah, those are all great questions, and thanks, Jenny, for doing a summary there. And to get you folks up to speed, and we'll be sharing back out in March. Chapter 3 is got an outline together, and I'm going to be meeting with the work group next week on this content, and some of it very much speaks to how to equitably raise funds at the local level, the different ways to do that, what are the different funding sources at the state, and whether the utility is a private or public entity, what they can access, and what both the grant side with the Clean Water Board and budget, and also the loan side. So that's stuff that's definitely captured in there. We do have in statute and in the budget a line item right now that incentivizes utility formation, and so maybe some overlap between this chapter 3 and chapter 1, which is sort of formation, is this question of like, are we trying to incentivize it, or are we mandating the creation of this and seeding funding? And that maybe gets to your other question, Christine, of how the clean water service providers are incentivized. They're established by rule, and they are entitled to a formula grant as part of that rule and as part of their performance. And so some of the questions about like how it's formed and whether that's happening at the state, whether it's enabled at the state, but then it has to be sort of a local level initiative to create, is certainly a suite of questions that the committee should be dialoguing over. And so I'm curious, does that answer your question, Christine, about clean water service providers? And does that?
I'm still confused on,
Oh.
because aren't they, I guess I just don't understand what they do, because when I read what they're supposed to do, right, they're supposed to look at the TMDLs in Lake Champlain, correct?
Yeah,
Isn't
so
it-
they're organizations. They're mostly regional planning commissions serve as a QUIS, but they're sort of a new hat that they put on, and they hold grant agreements with the state, and every year they get a formula amount of money and a target for phosphorus reduction. And so there's a whole process by which we say you are assigned this many kilograms of phosphorus or pounds of phosphorus that you need to achieve based on what can't be achieved from the regulatory side for your basin, scaled down with the available dollars we have to give you. So that is the cost rate methodology process and annual fund allocation. We have resources on it. We spoke a little bit to it for the committee, but we're happy to follow up and share links on the presentation on how they
So
get
we
their
just-
money.
And so you would still have these in addition to regions? If we went to regionalization, you'd have both?
I think that is not a question we can answer necessarily right now, but it would be helpful to, that's what we're capturing in the report, are some of these overlaps, right? So when we think about the permitting question, which is like, how do we take 3 acre that doesn't necessarily operate with a phosphorus reduction target, but Terry's going to look at me and correct me here. It's like water quality volume by site-ish thing, treating a 50% redevelopment standard. Those are words. Terry's still staring at me. I need a nod. Okay, he's smiling. Okay.
You're there.
Right.
This is recorded.
50%
Great.
of 70% or
Close enough.
5%.
Thank you. So how we translate from that to a model by which we have a percent of like a number that's phosphorus and we're trying to reduce by, can we not only look at the clean water service provider model where there is a phosphorus target to reduce by and they make plans and do projects, or potentially the MS4 model where they have a phosphorus reduction target and a phosphorus control plan to do that as models, but then also capture in the report questions of overlap. The revenue question, the revenue raising question, the permitting question, the formation question. I think all chapters are probably going to wrestle with, how do we deal with the overlap with existing stormwater utilities and MS4s? How do we deal with the overlap of non-regulatory funding or TMDL funding and progress in the non-regulatory space? And so part of what we're trying to do with some of these chapters is, those are sort of like ways we can brainstorm solutions and then present back to the committee, like, is there a recommendation on which solution to go to and the pros and cons? But maybe we can't, I guess, Luz, I can't say this is how it would work right now, because I don't think we know the answer, but we could say like, are the MS4s to expand to multi-regional entities and taking on all the permits of MRGP for all the participating towns? Should the clean water service providers do all the regulatory and non-regulatory? Is this a third weird option? Um, we could articulate all those, but I don't know if we have the answer yet.
Right, because it seems like they're by basin, which is what, before you got on, is what we were talking about, regionalization by, stormwater basin, not by MS4s, because town lines don't match where stormwater goes. It seems like there's already kind of a process in place, but
I think you're right. I mean, there is, I mean, it's already, the frameworks, I
Kind
think a
of
lot of the
thing.
frameworks are already there for a lot of
Right.
this, right? So one of the things we were talking about a little bit earlier, Gianna, is that, there's already language in current statute that says MS4 or stormwater utility. Like the term stormwater utilities already exists, right? And then it's just a matter of, I guess, breaking that out a little bit more. But we also identified that the stormwater utility would have to be quasi-government agency that has the authorities to, raise funding and things like that. Have the ability to acquire lands, be able to negotiate and get into, easements and, things like that.
Incur debt.
Incurred debt. Yep, exactly. And I think you touched on a really good point there is like, what's the incentive? And that kind of goes back to, my question was kind of rhetorical, but I wanted to get it out there, exactly what you just said, which is that they're required by statute for there to be one. So, it's not like these people are voluntarily going, oh, that sounds great, let me go do that, somebody had to step up. And I think that we'd be looking at something very similar to that. And what I'm hoping for, well, I mean, yes, I think it just has to be required. And then there may need to be a committee that is charged with interviewing and setting up the original members of what those utilities are, right? And who's going to run them. And I don't know how Champlain Solid Waste District got its first start. So I'm sure somebody had to say, okay, we're going to hire this person to lead it, right? And build a team, and then they start to build their team out as their capacities and needs expanded.
Yeah, and chapter 1 outline right now, which is on utility formation, is starting to articulate the suite of capacities that you'd want to make sure a utility could have, like owning land and taking on debt and raising local revenue, and then capturing the pros and the incentives and disincentives to formation, and whether or not that magically appears as an entity, or whether or not that should be, created in statute and enshrined in statute, I think again is probably a recommendation out of the committee and less so out of the chapter 1 work group. The work group is more trying to articulate like what are reasons a regional utility would want to form. And those reasons might change based on scale, right? So like a municipality may not be incentivized to join if they're not taking on the MRGP road obligations. Oh, but a regional utility is going to take that on for us? Like maybe that, so the incentive changes by the scale too. And I think that's maybe part of what they're trying to capture is, again, across these different scales of solutions, what is an incentive or disincentive? And then what's the conclusion, therefore, for how the legislature might want to approach this, whether that's throwing a bunch of money out there as a carrot, framing it in a way that leads people to want to join or otherwise.
Well, I think getting out from the burdens of the permits is one of the biggest incentives, right? And as we were saying earlier, it's like with MS4s right now, if we take in a system, we take over like an operational permit in 9050, used to be 9020s, or I'm sorry, not 9020s, 9010s. If we take those into our permits, then that property no longer has that separate permit, right? So now it's just part of this larger umbrella of, that the MS4 has. And I think that something similar to that would make the most sense with a regional utility, where the regional utility is the permitted entity, and with underneath that entity's permit, it has all this infrastructure that it manages, just as, going back to Harry's example, as we do with water lines and for water distribution or for sewer connection systems, right? Where there are still some privately held and managed, sections, there's still some privately held pump stations that do, transfer into and connect to our system. We set the rules and regulations around that. We monitor it. We go out, we have our own requirements related to that as the operator of our systems, but we're permitted. But it's just one permit for all of this infrastructure.
So some of what you're getting at, Christine, I'm wondering if you, looking at the draft outline for chapter 2, part of what you're speaking to might be this work group articulating what's in and out of a regional permit. Like what are the obligations that are regionalized in a permit and what aren't? And is that a section that you'd want to capture in this outline if it's not otherwise there? Would that make sense in terms of like what I'm hearing you wrestle with and where it could fit and making sure it's captured, that sort of dialogue and thought is captured?
Because I'm not understanding, to me, we're just kind of talking about, seems like that is part of chapter 2 already in the outline that's existing here.
Oh, okay.
Because
Sorry,
I mean,
Discussion of mechanics for how a separate entity applies and assumes permitting,
yeah,
right?
right, yeah.
That's chapter 2.
So part of it is maybe under 1C, is that what you're looking at? Like what are the permitting obligations of this entity versus the private sites and municipalities?
9C2A.
Oh, I'm sorry, you're talking about specific references in statute. I'm saying 1C in the outline of chapter 2. Different letters, different pages. Great, thank you for whoever's sharing.
So yeah,
Yeah,
Gianna,
not
we've
so
been
much
talking a lot about incentive, and then we're getting
Thank you
into
for
the
documenting.
mechanics more as well now with,
Hmm.
how that would work in terms of the permitting, what type of permit are we envisioning, fees, etc.
Thank you. I'm so sorry. Thank you for orienting me where you are on this cell line. That's
No
helpful.
problem. That's where the red text hasn't been added yet, I think is.
But I will say, I've been typing some fairly random notes into this, but during the discussion that we just had, I was scrolling down, and I think a lot of what we were talking about is already covered in some of the subsequent parts of the outline as well. So I think our conversation is relevant, but also maybe if we go a little bit farther down in the outline, we might, it might be worthwhile.
And I don't know if Terry shared this yet. One thing that we're trying to, maybe this is what the highlight is. Terry, I'm sorry to be here that far. 2 hours late. Oh,
Oh,
hour
it's
late.
my,
Oh my
it's my
goodness.
highlighting. It's probably random.
Oh, so sections of this, I think we're seeing there's a lot here that we can draft the content of to sort of articulate, this is how this happens now. And so if permitting for 3 acres in the current regulatory structure, there's a lot drafted here from Terry and his team, which is awesome. And then how could it look to take 3 acre and put it on a phosphorus reduction mechanism? DEC could draft how the MS4 thing works, how the clean water service provider thing works, and explain that. And maybe it's really helpful to hear from the work group, like what are the, other than articulating other models that currently exist, what is also critical to include in this outline or key points for discussion and decision that we'd want the full committee to weigh in on.
And I think I'm scrolling down because I do think that some of those questions are captured here. And yes, I think it's helpful to have the information on the current system. But I don't know that we want too much detail on that because, I mean, we want detail as it's relevant to potentially transitioning to a different system. And these are some of the questions that we were just talking about is like, who creates the regional plans? Are they mandatory or are they voluntary? And then there is, I know we were brainstorming a bit about benefits or incentives and disincentives. And I think we've probably identified some that could be added to this list. And then maybe this is the bottom. I like your idea of having questions for the committee, for the full committee, potentially at the end. And as many people have said, there's so much overlap between the different chapters that I think we're going to be interested to see each other's outlines because there's like going to be a lot of back and forth.
I think one of the key questions is it translatable for the phosphorus control plan approach that's used for MS4s to be taken for, say, a watershed-based utility? We have this equation that's applied. We look at the redevelopment standard, which is essentially equates to treating at least half of a 3-acre site of the impervious area that needs to meet the requirements, and then multiplying by what we use this, average approach for phosphorus removal across all types of different sites and practices. So the minimum would be 50%, and then you go up to your 90% or more for infiltration-based practices. So that's a metric that's used to get at, allowing for more flexibility under that plan when there's the incorporation. So the operational permit goes away with the incorporation into the MS4, but the MS4 then has this equation applied to their overall plan within the MS4. Is that, an approach that could be favorable for allowing for flexibility where you have a 3-acre site or sites, and instead of treating those sites, you're looking elsewhere. Now, I think one of the challenges is that the MS4 they typically would do that on municipal owned land or where it makes sense. They've already got some access there, some ability to easily do something. With the utility, there might need to be some work done to enable them to easily find other options, if that was the idea, to find other better options perhaps for meeting the requirements.
So, sorry, Terry, I got to jump in there real quick because I think that's one of the things that I've always really been frustrated with when trying to implement the the phosphorus plans or the flow restoration plans is that the idea that municipalities have land that they can put these practices on, I think is just it's a misnomer. Not all municipalities have land, and not always is that land where it should be, right? So I think that I think any utility is gonna have the same challenge that an MS4 right now would have, which is trying to identify partners, local partners that would be willing to either donate their land or sell their land, or trying to find a way to put these resources on it. We've been struggling for the last 7 years now to try to get one of our systems constructed, because the only land that we have is impacted by wetlands. So I think that goes back to what Harry was saying, that I think they'd have to have the ability to be able to purchase or condemn land if needed to, which I don't think anybody wants to go through that. I think that's a bad idea, but they're gonna probably have to buy it. But yeah, the
We also
land
have a
issues, go ahead.
We also have a placeholder in chapter 3 about the fee structure, incentivizing hosting BMPs or upsizing existing BMPs. So it doesn't solve all of the problems, but we're also trying to capture it on the revenue raising side and incentive structure as an FYI.
Well, right, and in that way, and I appreciate that, Gianna, because that is that is a great way, that is one of the ways that we have been reaching our goals, right? Is reevaluating the systems that we currently have and then making determinations as to whether or not we can, make upgrades to them to capture more phosphorus or, better reduce peak flows, things like that. And oftentimes that's what we are having to do.
I do think, while I guess one flag or thought for this work group is, while we can point to the clean water service provider or the MS4 mechanism as a model by which the permit could operate, I wonder if it would also be helpful to unpack how such a regional entity could adopt the MRGP obligations or the MS4 obligations. If the committee is looking at that larger scale, we kind of already have a model through the MS4s about what a 3-acre site adopted into an MS4 permit looks like. And we could say, oh, maybe it's 3-acre to regional. We've got a model for that. But do we have a model for how an MS4 permit could be adopted to a regional entity, or how MRGP obligations could? That feels even trickier in some ways. And so spending some time unpacking like where those hiccups might be in assuming that, and also assuming all the prior operating permit obligations of these towns or of these, like, what is the scope and scale of that, would be worth probably talking through from a permitting perspective. Yeah.
I would like to offer on that one, Gianna, that there's a whole boatload of statute out there regarding town highways and municipal responsibilities for town highways. And I wonder how regional stormwater utility would interface with dealing with the municipal roads stuff. We can't really have, practically, I would say, a utility operating a stormwater system within our town highways. So appreciate the concept, but I could see there being a boatload of cross currents with other highway related obligations.
Absolutely. And so, like, looking at what Christine was talking about like what are the services that a utility needs to do or that they would take on, might look different if they're assuming responsibility for MRGP permit, right? There's all that statutory change that would have to happen. And then are they just paying the towns to do that maintenance, or are they now doing all that? Like, kind of cross comparing the scope and scale of the obligation to like what would be an optimal interface with those permittees would be interesting. I mean, I don't know the answer, and I'm sorry, I'm taking a lot of airtime for this work group.
Yeah, I think they'd have to be broken out and separated. I don't think I'm with you, Harry, on that. I think the requirements that the state's placed on roads, and road drainage would have to stand alone and continue to operate separate from some of these other operational permits. Because there's no way that any community is going to give up allow some utility to come in and say, well, you gotta, manage the drainage off your road this way or that way, or, we're gonna come in and do yeah, no way. I wanna, no,
It's not workable.
no. It's too complicated. way too like in roads, roads are just such a public safety. And there's so much that goes into them. It's overly burdensome, and which is why even locally, we have two separate departments to manage stormwater and our highways, right, and our roads. Yes, our highway does do some stormwater maintenance as far as like replacing culverts or ditching work, stabilizing ditches, but push comes to shove, they don't do stormwater. We have a whole separate one-person department that does that. Because it is so different and so complicated. And she doesn't know anything about, I mean, she knows very little about roads, right? And sure, she's learning a lot more than she probably ever thought she would, but I think those have to exist separately. Especially when I look at what the state's, where the direction the state's going to with things like chloride and managing runoff and chloride pollutant from roads. I think that's going to be more and more critical that those two stay in their own lanes.
We have a culvert failure right now that our guys are working overtime on in North Hollow Road. And we got a section of road closed and we're going crazy trying to get the culvert in and getting the road reopened. Could you imagine if we had to call the stormwater utility and tell them that there was a culvert failure on North Hollow Road? Right?
Right.
So,
Yeah, we'll be there next month.
right. So appreciate the thought, but
to answer your question, Gianna, and I think that was kind of going, you were asking earlier, it's like, what does it look like to bring these utilities or like for it to transfer up, right? And how do you bring it up into the regional levels? And I think that's what I was trying to hint on a little bit earlier, is that there's just a single larger, permit that these regionalized utilities get. And then if local smallers, whether they're residential, commercial, whether they're half acre or 1 acre or 3 acres or 10 acres of impervious, whatever they are, if they have an operating permit, then they can have the option to relinquish that operating permit to the regional utility, so long as they also provide the resource, like provide what's needed for that regional utility to take ownership and operational, the ownership of that. And I don't even know if ownership is really the right term for it, but operations and maintenance, right? Because Vermont Gas coming into a development doesn't own the right of way or doesn't own the easement area. They just have an easement to go in and do maintenance, repairs, and upgrades. It's not necessarily transferring ownership. So I think that, you set the utility up, you give them a 5-year period, to say, to go through that transitional period. And these single operators, operating permits, can then transfer into and under the umbrella of the larger utilities, permit structure. And I think as far as MS4s go, I think the MS4 shifts away from all these, managing 25 or 30 stormwater utilities. I think they can be, there's no reason that those should have to be held within the MS4 still. Those singulars can go to this regional stormwater utility. And I think there's plenty of other things for them to work on.
Shane, I saw you come off mute. Did you want to share some thoughts?
It was Christine just jumped to it before. I just wanted to mention how the committee was talking about expanding the breadth of not just 3-acre sites, but all operational stormwater permits and giving the opportunity to all those sites similar to the 3-acre sites. And so that might, impact how the phosphorus calculation model would be based, if it's following the 3-acre to MS4 pathway, this non-3-acre to regional entity pathway might, I don't know how that phosphorus tracking would look, but yeah.
Well, I think it goes under the developed lands, right? I
Right.
think that 3 acres is all part of that developed land calculation, which includes the half acres, the 1 acres, really kind of covers all of that.
I would like to
But-
suggest Shane, that the phosphorus tracking be like, water quality monitoring at the confluence of our rivers.
Yeah.
I like that better. I like that a lot more than the model.
Well, you gotta start somewhere, right? So you're modeling it and then, but I think there needs to be supporting, I think I've certainly heard over the years frustration and shock and awe that there's not a lot more, that there's not actual more direct sampling that goes on, but for today, to appease the EPA, I think we have to continue with what we have, but I agree that, we should be moving towards a direction of active sampling, and that could be requirements on these regional stormwater permits at a later date once they're established, right? So maybe looking at 2045, saying that you have to have monitoring like we do with USGS for stream levels, right? And do maybe periodic samplings, or we do with our wastewater facilities that within these water bodies. I think just side note here, I think one of the values of kind of the idea of allowing the regional utilities to incorporate all these smaller permits as well is it would significantly reduce the burden on the state for having to review, monitor, track, deal with all the paperwork for, I don't know how many operating permits you guys have. Gotta be, I've looking here, at your permit expediting program report to the legislature from this last year. It looks like you guys received 594 operational stormwater permits, NOIs. So that's a lot, 594 permits. If we can consolidate that down a little bit, would be a lot less burden on the state.
So I appreciate the clarification of like roads being out of scope because of all the other things that serves, and really looking at operational permits. And then because of my newness and like what is an MS4 permit, but recognizing there's minimum control measures like above and beyond maybe what we're trying to solve for here. How are, maybe just like round robin, how are some of you envisioning this interacting? Would an MS4 stand alone and a regional utility serve otherwise? Would a regional utility take a section of the MS4 obligations that are operational permit focused? Would a regional utility take on all the minimum control measures and otherwise? And so, and are there other options there? I'm just curious how that overlap might
That's a
work.
great question, Gianna. I think that's a great question, and I'll take a stab at that real quick. And that's to say that I don't think most MS4s currently in existence today are actually required under the federal rules. I think that the state made the choice to establish them based on their own local states, state policies and rules to try to make improvements to water quality. And for some reason, it sounds like the state stopped creating more MS4s for whatever reason. But if the Clean Water Act, which sets the perimeters of how big of a population is, the population density is to have an MS4, then there's some requirements, and I think then they'd have to be there, and there's some standard requirements that the MS4 is required to have, but that MS4 is not required under the Clean Water Act to take over or to manage these stormwater treatment practices. I think that those practices could be relinquished to a regional stormwater utility, and the other obligations under the Clean Water Act for an MS4 can still be met. Being those, going out and maybe looking at construction activities, there's nothing that really specifies the frequency of which that needs to happen. Education outreach. I think that they could be met pretty easily. And I think there'd only be 1 or 2 communities in the state, if even that, that would be really required. It's been a minute since I've looked at it, but I thought the threshold was over 10,000 people. And like, I'm not even gonna say, because it's been a while since I've looked at Clean Water Act thresholds for MS4s, but it's pretty high.
Jane, you
Did
are
I
an
hear you right,
MS4.
Christine, that
Okay.
those, being an MS4 was a requirement of the state, not we didn't cross the thresholds for the feds.
A lot of our MS4s would not meet the Clean Water Act's threshold for an MS4.
Christine.
Yeah, I'll just so Christine, it kind of sounded like you were describing a utility alongside an MS4, like not as much overlap there, kind of keeping the MS4s and their minimum control measures and the utility kind of filling the gaps.
Only I would say that it's only if it's required by the Clean Water Act, not by state statute. I would love to see a lot of these MS4s get dissolved.
Right. I think it would be nice if the regions could take that over.
And not that the positions that are there, people are, not that I want to like get people out of their job. There's still so much to do, right?
Yeah.
Because the state's going to turn around and say chloride, go manage the runoff from your roads and chloride. And there's so much. But yeah, I think MS4s, unless required by Clean Water Act, in meeting that threshold of an MS4 should be dissolved. Absolutely.
Remember,
And
if we
replaced
go
with these
regionalization,
utilities.
we'll
Yeah.
need new staff, and so the right people
Right.
to
The
staff
right
it would
people
be
to
the
staff it would be the
people.
MS4 people.
Right,
Yeah.
but I don't see that as losing a job. I
You're
just
right.
think it
Thank you
would
for
change.
capturing that.
No,
Yep.
you know what I mean?
Yep.
Because you still need,
You're
you need
absolutely right.
someone with knowledge to run these regions for sure.
Yep. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I totally agree. I just wanted, I'm glad I clarified because I maybe didn't understand you the first time. So yeah, I mean, I could totally see an entity filling the 6 minimum control measures in their scope.
That sounds like a
Right.
great action item. Maybe we can engage with Sage too, or I know Jenny has said that she's really loves reading legal language in her free time, but unpacking the obligations at the federal level versus state for
I've got it right
here.
here. I've got it right here. So the small MS4 is under the Clean Water Act. So based on consensus on the Census Bureau of urbanized area with a population of 50,000 or more.
Well, I don't think Shelburne has that many yet, do we, Shane?
Alternative criteria
Not
would
quite.
be a
Not quite.
population
Maybe a
density
fifth.
exceeding 1,000 people per square mile. So 50,000 people or 1,000 people per square mile is the threshold. I don't know that. I think you could dissolve the MS4s just like that.
So in terms of returning back to the outline, right, and a goal of bringing an outline of thoughts back to the committee, it sounds like there's some interesting consensus here that it would be worth having a section of the outline that really dives into the mechanics of absorbing the MS4 permit and what statutory change does or doesn't need to change, what the logistics would have to be, like thinking about staffing, thinking about all of those components, the town ordinances that have launched the stormwater utilities at that level. Like there's all the ramifications there, but it sounds like it's worthwhile to capture that as an outline piece, and we can engage with the MS4 program staff, the municipal staff. Municipal section. I don't know their names. Christy and Emily.
I think
And Ryan.
I think adopting and creating this regionalized stormwater utility, you would, in doing that as part of that transitional period, you can dissolve the requirements of the MS4s altogether. Like once you take it out of statute, then there's really no reason for them to exist.
There's 2 odd ones, the Burlington Airport, it has its own MS4, and I guess you could treat that as a commercial site, you know what I mean? And then UVM is the other one, that are not municipalities. That's just a little bit,
Yeah, no, I hear what you're
a
saying.
little bit different twist.
Yeah.
So we've talked about MS4, we talked about other operational permits, we've talked about roads. Are there other overlapping? I mean, I think TS4 is a section that should probably be captured in this chapter as well. Thinking about there is the obligation for VTrans to be paying into stormwater utilities at a reduced rate. And so we're capturing a little bit of that on the revenue raising side, but it is maybe a question to ask, like, where does state permitting land in this space versus local permitting too?
I think state stays right. I think
Yeah.
state stays where in its own structure. I don't think this needs to involve state transportation permit, because I think that their infrastructure that does go beyond all the boundaries of watersheds, right? So it's such a large and intricate system with so much impervious and so much runoff. I don't think that it should be the responsibility of a regionalized stormwater utility to deal with that, nor do I think the state agency of transportation wants to surrender, just like the local communities don't want people coming into their right of way.
And I didn't mean
Yeah.
to suggest that this utility should take it on, but it's probably worth having a sentence or two about that in this
Yeah.
chapter.
Oh, right.
That
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
hey, there's
yeah.
also this other infrastructure and landscape, and by the way, the TS4 exists, and that's, acknowing that
Outside of what
recommendation
we're
is likely
talking about.
outside the scope.
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah.
okay, I understand. I didn't, I understand what you're saying now, Gianna. Yeah,
Yeah,
I would agree
we
with
don't
that.
want that.
Yeah, I would agree with
We
you
don't
on
want that
that.
in the
That should be
regionalization.
clarified that would be outside of the scope of like the regionalization and dissolving the MS4s.
Terry, would it be helpful to talk about next steps since we're about 12 minutes?
Yeah, before we forget, I did want to just cover, we have another meeting scheduled, I believe, a week from today at the same time.
It's out there. If people want to make it. Thank you.
It is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, but I mean, just thinking even beyond that, is bi-weekly preferred for these subgroup meetings, sort of in between the larger meetings, to get maybe some additional. I know we wouldn't have another one, I think, prior to the February meeting coming up, although we could, if that's desired. But what's the thought there on the timing here of how often we want to do this?
I mean, I think bi-weekly is fine. I think if we can get a 2-hour block like we did today, so I think it really kind of takes that kind of time to be able to get into this material.
Yep.
Other
When is
thoughts?
the meeting next week? I don't think I have that invite and I don't think I'm available.
On my calendar, it just shows you and Terry on the invite.
Yeah. So, again, sorry, I had not sent anything further out about that, because I wanted to meet here. But I just put a couple placeholders, Jenny, so I put another placeholder for this time next week, on Thursday. More or less, we're holding this room and where we're at here, but I wanted to check in to see if you guys wanted to meet a second time, or what was going on. Again, I forgot, I did not realize that you were the lead on this as well, so I wasn't, I went to,
We were a little confused.
yeah.
It's okay.
And
I
Terry-
think, yeah, but I'm not available Thursday afternoon next week.
All right, so yeah, so we'll cancel that and plan to meet.
Terry, where is the document you're working on? I'm sorry, I missed that. Did you put it in the chat, something to link to the document you were sharing?
Oh, so I had emailed it to Harry. I can also email it to you if you need it.
That would be great.
And Gianna, the question had come up about posting that on the website, and I don't know if that's been done yet, but folks were looking for it, the outline that I had created, so.
Outline?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we haven't quite figured out, because they're changing like daily as we edit and add things to them. When is the best point? I mean, maybe we could Terry, maybe we can talk to Chris as well, who's facilitating the first work group, and just see if we want to, at least by the February meeting, have like a version for everyone to look at, and with the understanding that the work groups are still working on it leading up to March. Would that be a good point in time?
You might want to watermark it draft, so it's really clear that it's not
Right.
a final document. But it just seemed like Terry was adding stuff today that I'd like to see.
Who was that Terry screen sharing with the notes, or that was Jenny?
No, it was
Okay.
me. But Terry, I can send you my notes if it's helpful for you. I mean, they're pretty
Yeah.
rough, but I thought it was helpful to be able to capture while
Sure.
we were talking.
Yeah, I
Okay, so
think
we're
if-
not,
if-
we're not planning to meet then
No.
again before we meet.
We think
and-
we have enough for the next meeting. Is that it? What I'm hearing?
I mean, we could on another date. I'm not, it's up to the members, I would say. If there's a desire to, we could. Or we could just wait until we have the next full committee meeting and then have another of these after that.
And I think in our next meeting, when we hear from, StemSwa, I think there's gonna be a lot that comes out of that, that's really gonna talk to what we're talking about right now.
Mhm.
So I would be okay waiting until our February meeting and then meeting after that. I would prefer to meet the week after that if we can.
Mhm.
I'd rather even get that on our calendar now so that we have that. And then maybe 2 weeks after that, or, if we do a bi-weekly kind of thing.
Sure.
I think that would be good. That would be the 19th. And I am open then, and probably if I hold that time, I should be able to stay available.
Okay, February 19th, we can do that. It's same time, 2 to 4. Is that okay for now? And if we need to, we could look into rescheduling if that's really needed. We could get that on the calendar at least for now. Okay.
May I offer a couple more thoughts on just some things that I heard? I encourage that we think about if we're going to be able to get to a regional stormwater system, that we require in statute the establishment of these and not rely on intermunicipal agreement. I know that intermunicipal agreements are extremely challenging, and I don't think we're really going to have any advancement of the big picture goal if we rely on that for, trying to establish this entity. I think this entity should be established by statute, like a municipality, so that they have all those municipal powers. I think I just wanted to point that out. And the second thing I'd like to say is that I almost wish that the committee can try to really look at it without all of the burden of the existing layers of all of the onions, and look at it more holistically. And I hope, some of the discussion today kind of pointed out maybe some possible ways that utilities do this kind of thing. And this could prove to be a success if it could simplify the processes that we currently have. If we're going to try to figure out how to get newly established regional entities to manage all the existing permit obligations. Pardon. That's going to be a big challenge. Excuse me.
Yeah, that's heard, Harry, and I do understand. I mean, we have a lot of operational permits going back decades, and so I think it's important if we do require the formation to allow flexibility and the number of permits that utility could feasibly manage, and that might you know, they could potentially add with time. Maybe they're able to increase their ability with new funding and staffing to manage permits, but I don't think we'd want to start off with that obligation of you're now required to just take on all of these operational permits. The option would perhaps be there though, right, to do so.
I have a question on just housekeeping for this. We're called a committee, so do we have to post minutes within 5 days and all that? Are we part of open meeting law? Just want to understand that.
This is a work group. This is not a formal subcommittee. This is a work group. So we are recording these to share for other committee members so folks can stay in tune on the progress, but not subject to open meeting laws. We're still trying to post when they're happening and let people join if they need to. But on that note, though, who owns this recording? And Christine, do all attendees have access? Are we able to download it and post it, or you don't know? Okay. I can
We'll get it
fiddle
figured out.
once we get off of this. Like usually my teams is like the recording is now available, but that's usually from in-state. And if that's not, maybe I'll have Danny follow up with you to try and get access to it so that we can make
Yeah,
it
who do you want it to
available.
go to, Danny? I mean, I should be able to download it and they might have to upload it to like an FTP or something, but we'll get it to whoever needs to
Yeah.
go to.
That would be great. Thank you. And if it's
Mhm.
easier for Terry to host in the future for that recording purpose piece, just let us know, or Danny can host so that there's no downloading, uploading needed.
Yeah, I wasn't really sure who would be here, being that it's a working group, so I was trying to get things going.
Yeah, that's no problem. And I think I can just set up the next one just for ease of, you know, transferring that recording and all that. I'll
Yeah.
get the next one on the calendar and we'll go from there.
Thanks, everyone. Well, we'll see you then in February.
Thanks for the good discussion, everybody.
Yes, thank
Thank
you, everybody.
you.
Thank you, Christine, for setting it up.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Bye.
Bye now.
Right.
Bye.